All right. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, welcome again to another exciting edition of SOC 315. I don't know what's going on or why my phone's buzzing. We'll ignore it for now. Okay, it's Friday. Okay, first of all, how was the lab? All good? Okay, perfect. And any questions about mini lab 1, which, as you should know, is due on Sunday at midnight, right? So any questions about that? I know it's probably, you're like, duh, it's so super straightforward. And yes, but still, any questions about it before I jump into lecture today? Okay, easy. You're all very easy. Okay, so what were we talking about last time? So we're talking about ethics, right? And we ended off on this slide, right? Talking about research ethics and what all that looks like. So, maybe if I go back a slide. Yeah, as we were talking about research ethics boards, right? What they look like. You know, basically every university now has one. And if you're doing any research that involves human beings, you're going to have to get research ethics approval, right? And in sociology, this is a good majority of projects. In quantitative, the only thing you're going to be doing in quantitative that wouldn't require research ethics approval would be using existing data sets. So everything else you're probably going to require research ethics approval. And you know, we talked about external representation, different disciplines, and all that fun stuff. And we ended off here, I believe, talking about how ethics approval for quantitative work tends to be a little bit easier to get, and it's a little bit quicker because, you know, there's this feeling in a lot of ethics boards that's a little bit more scientific. It's a little bit more at arm's length, right? You're not typically survey work, right? You're not dealing with participants directly. You know, so, and surveys are the tool we use the most. And so it's seen as a little bit more distant. It's harder to do harm. But if you were doing something like, you know, experimental design that had a quantitative component, you would definitely need research ethics approval. That one would probably be long to get. Even something, and we'll talk about the exact methods later, structured observation, where you say, you know, taking notes about people and activities and how many times people say certain things or whatever. I'll talk about structured observation. It's not a super used method. It would probably be a little bit more difficult because, again, you'd be interacting more closely with people. But for surveys, they tend to be pretty easy to get because, you know, the amount of trauma you can do to a person with a survey question is limited. So it's not impossible. You'd have to work pretty hard. Challenge accepted. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Qualitative work, it's getting a little bit better, but ethics work for qualitative projects tends to be a little bit more difficult to get. Okay, so among the challenges, you're working really typically pretty closely with people, right? So if you're doing, you know, participant observation, why some days my pen lags and other days it's super quick, I don't know. Ethnography or interviews, right? Those are going to be your 3 big ones that require ethics. Oh, stop it. All of those you're working pretty closely with people, right? You're in direct contact with people. You know, in a participant observation, you're among people in kind of different roles. Interviews, obviously, you're sitting down and you're talking to people for extended periods of time. And so the potential for harm is a little bit more elevated, right? And so qualitative work tends to be a little bit harder. The other thing is because of the method, right? So I talked about grounded theory and how qualitative work in a lot of ways tends to be iterative, right? You start out gathering data and then figuring out what your themes are, what you might, you know, what kind of conclusions you might come to based on this data, and then you go and collect more, and you might modify your methodology as you go, and you're finding new themes, right? So it's a little bit more indeterminate sometimes, right? So this can cause a little bit of trouble with research ethics boards, particularly with external members, right? If you have an external member who's, say, from the natural sciences or medicine or some kind of discipline that's a little bit more structured and purely scientific, this can potentially lead to misunderstandings, right? When you're like, my method is this, but also maybe this, and I may change it midway through, depending on what I find, right? Obviously, you would phrase it more eloquently than that, but that's sort of, what grounded theory does, right? So, because it's a little bit more indeterminate, it might be hard to communicate that to people who are non-specialists in the area, and they may have a lot more questions about how you're going to do this work. Yeah, it might capture data on people that they might not want observed. So, if you're doing, let's say, a covert ethnography, right? Or where you're basically like, we'll say, because I'm going to come back to this example over and over. You want to study furries, right? And so you think the best way of studying furries is to throw on, you're going to go down to Furries R Us, I don't know, where you buy a furry suit. And you're going to buy yourself a costume so that you are a cat, right? Litter box not included. Sorry, a terrible joke. Why did I do that? Oh, just because I'm the worst. All right. And you're going to go, and then you're going to go down to the big furry convention that happens in Atlanta, Georgia, or wherever. And you're going to pose as a member of the furry community, and you're going to write about all of the things that you saw, right? Now, theoretically, that is okay, because people at the furry convention are in a public space, right? They are in a public space. So you try to figure out how to say more than that without being offensive. They're in a public space, right? This is an open area that anyone can buy tickets for, and so you don't have the assumption of privacy in such a space. But a research ethics board might still be like, well, people, if you're saying you're going to do this covertly because you want the least reactivity possible, you want as natural an environment, but you might see people doing things or saying things that they wouldn't actually want recorded, and because you're saying you're doing it covertly, you're not getting consent forms. So they might shoot it down on those grounds, right? Or even, public things that happen in public spaces, you might observe things that people don't want recorded, don't want disclosed, that kind of stuff. So there's lots of reasons that they might shoot it down, right? Or at very least, they would want a really strong informed consent. So, a really cautious research ethics board could restrict the project. It could say, okay, you can do this part, but you can't do this part. Prevent funding, right? They could, prevent your funding, go to the funding agency and say, yeah, you need to pull the funding from this person, or prevent the research project altogether. Now, again, that's pretty rare. You'd have to be doing something really unethical to end up in any of these situations. More than likely, what research ethics boards are going to say is, no, you need to go back and rethink your whole project and reconceptualize and come back to us, and we'll try. You can try again, especially if you're a junior researcher. But these are all possibilities. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay. So yes, the Tri-Council policy, or TICSPA 2, has, provides for some variation in research methods. And typically, if you're using a recognized methodology, you might get feedback, but chances are you'll be able to get it through eventually, as long as what you're proposing is not wildly immoral. Okay. And the three core overlapping principles that they're worried about in terms of ethics is respect for the person, concern for welfare, and justice. We'll go through these in turn. Okay, so respect for the person, right? Core. So research subjects are not objects, right? They're people, they're subjects, or resources for you to use to get your data. They're human beings that inherently deserve respect. Individuals have basic human rights, and that includes dignified treatment by you, the researcher, right? You can't be exploiting them. Okay, and to that end, when you're doing research, you need to get informed consent, right? So they need to understand what you're doing, what the risks might be, what the benefits might be, and they need to sign off on, wanting to do those things. Okay, now that said, informed consent is free and ongoing, right? So it has to be free. It can't have any coercion, and it's not like, how to put this? Once you have them sign the form, you can just push things through, and then, it's like, I got you to sign the form and now I can do all my unethical behaviors. Thank you for signing the form. You've signed your rights away. Huzzah, right? It's kind of like, if you go and do something like whitewater rafting, you sign the waiver that says they're not responsible for any harm that happens to you. But if they actively put you in harm's way, right, in a way that's not reasonable, you could still sue them. It's a little bit of an aside, but people have to be able to withdraw their consent if they don't like what's happening, within reason, right? Within reason, but there has to be a sort of, ability to withdraw. So what does this look like? Okay, it's necessary for researchers and participants to act as collaborators, right? We're working together to get more information. The part about being ongoing, right, is if they want to say stop or remove their data from your study, there has to be a process with which they can do that. It doesn't have to be forever, right? So let's say you're interviewing someone, right? And this is what I did when I was doing my PhD dissertation. And actually, when I was doing a research project in Edmonton in 2019 too on Catholic organizations, and I had focus groups. And in both cases, what I did was basically I said, and it's in the consent letter, that people, if they wanted to, if they'd gone through the process, we finished our interview, or we'd done the focus groups, and they decided that, hey, actually, I feel really uncomfortable with what I said, and I would like either a particular comment removed, or actually I would like everything I said taken out completely, the interview deleted or not used in your research, or my parts of the focus group not used. They basically had for the focus groups, they had 1 week to let me know, right? So if in 1 week they were like, I don't like it, I would say, okay, I'll take your data out. For the other one, for my PhD project, it was a month, right? Because they were fairly long interviews, and some of them wanted me to get back to them with the quotes I was going to use, and then they were like, okay, you can use that one, but not that one, right? But it's free and ongoing, so that people feel like they have control over their information, and the ongoing part limits you from asking really exploitative questions. On a survey, what does this look like? Basically, there's always, on my consent letters for surveys, there's always a little clause that says, if you exit the survey before completion, your data will not be used, right? So until you finish the survey, you can stop at question, if it's a 20 question survey, you can stop at question 19, not answer question 20, and we'll throw away the 19 questions you answered. So again, once they hit submit, that's it. But before that, they can remove their data by stopping, right? So you want that ongoing component always built in to whatever project you're doing. And again, like I said, it doesn't have to be like, oh, for the next 16 years, if you don't want me to use your interview, you can just tell me not to. You don't want that, because then people could come back to you after you've published 3 books with the data, and what do? But you can give them a reasonable amount of time. Okay. So participants have to be advised, oops, come on, stop it, of risks and potential benefits. So not every study is going to have risks, right? Not every study has risks. Sometimes you can just put, there is no risk to participating in this study. But say you were, interviewing people on, something potentially traumatic, right? The impact of say, residential schools on their lives, right? That could potentially be traumatic. You might want to put in the risks like, hey, we're going to be discussing, things that have potentially traumatic consequences. So just so you're aware, these questions are going to come, and you don't have to participate if you don't want to, right? Risk like that. Obviously, if there's a risk of physical harm, right? If something you're doing, and I can't imagine what research project it is that would, in sociology, that would potentially lead to physical harm, people have to be advised of that, right? I guess if you're, some of these classic psychology experiments, like you may receive a small electrical shock. You'd have to say that, in the consent letter. Whatever you can think of. You have to be pretty extensive. Like if there's any risks at all, you want to make sure you put that in there, whether it's, traumatic topics, difficult topics, anything like that in interviews or in questionnaires or surveys, right? You want to be like, we will be asking questions about this. So just be advised. So risks, anything, whether it be very small, very big, you want to make sure it's there. Okay, the potential benefits, this is usually monetary, right? So in a lot of studies, right, in order to get people to participate, you give them a small inducement, right? So a lot of studies now, it's like a $25 gift card, right? It's like, hey, if you participate in my focus group, you will get a $25 Visa gift card, as a thank you for participating. And this one is an ethical gray zone. You'll be entered into a draw to win a new, a 60-inch television, right? We can talk about why that's potentially a problem. Anyway, if there is a potential benefit, you have to disclose it on your consent form, right? So again, that they know what they're getting and what they might be exposed to beforehand, right? And all of this needs to be outlined in your consent letter. Perfect. I moved over without even intending to. Okay, so this is the sample consent letter that is from the textbook. So you can certainly base your consent letter, because you'll have to write up a consent letter when you put together your bigger project, and it's part of mini lab number 2, right? So you have to kind of put it together, but it's pretty easy, right? You just kind of follow this, and if you look at the one that I've provided on on Canvas, I have an information and consent letter template. That's the one I always use for my own stuff. It's just to kind of follow that general outline. Okay, and it needs to have a bunch of information, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you need to have on here. Okay, so it's pretty simple, right? What is the research project? What are you doing? What are you looking for, right? What are you trying to find out? So explain your research project. Your method. You have to tell your participants what they will be doing, right? So if you're sitting down for an interview, it's like, your participation in this project will be to participate in an interview with the researcher, right? Or you will be filling out a 30-question survey that should take about 15 minutes, or whatever it happens to be, right? So whatever the method is, you will be put into a simulated prison scenario where half of you will be assigned as guards and half of you will be assigned as inmates, right? That is your methodology, right? So you have to state that up front so they know what they might be doing. You have to have a section, on the potential risks and potential benefits, and you can see that right here in the letter that's up on the screen, right? There is no known risk in participating in this study. Participation in this study is voluntary. You may refuse to participate, not answer questions, feel comfortable, blah, 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 blah. You may withdraw at any time. And then, right, the benefits. Once we have processed your questionnaire, you will be sent $25, and your name will be entered into a draw for a chance to win a prize of $100,000. Okay, so risks and benefits, right, should be outlined right there in your letter. The names of those in charge. So, if you're, you have a PhD and you're the one running the project, you just have to put your name. If you are a PhD student, right, or a candidate, or a master's student, obviously you have to have your name because you're going to be the PI, the principal investigator, but you're also going to have the name of your supervisor because, at least in theory, though they will 100% throw you under the bus at the first opportunity, your supervisor technically is responsible for any unethical conduct that you undertake. Why? Well, they're supposed to be supervising you, at least in theory. Doesn't always work that way. But, okay, so pretty simple, right? So for, if we're talking about, student, it's your name, you, and a supervisor, right? Supervisor. So, and I think that's what I have listed out on my template. The affiliated institution and contact information, right? So this would be, U of A, and here typically the contact information. So you'll have your email, your supervisor's email, and then, the email address and the phone number of the research ethics board. Obviously you don't have to do this for the purposes of this class. For this part, you will also always have your pro number, which is your research ethics approval, right? You would always have a pro number to say that you have, research ethics approval. And it's like, if you have any, it'll say something like, if you have any concerns about this project, please phone the research ethics board and you can ask questions of the research ethics board. Okay. And then a few other things, right? Assurance of confidentiality. And obviously this is going to look different in different kinds of settings. In a survey, you might say like, no personal information is going to be collected in terms of your name and, contact information. So you won't be identified in the survey. If you have, say, interviews, it might be a little bit different where you could give people the option, right? So you could be like, how would you like to be identified in this? You can choose how you'd like to be identified in any published material that comes out of this study, right? So for example, when I was doing work on Russian TV, I talked to this guy who had worked in Russian TV. He was a consultant for one of the big Hollywood studios, and he'd gone over to help them make a bunch of TV shows, like sitcoms that had been made in the US, and then turn them into Russian versions of those shows. And, what did he want? He wanted to be identified as an international format consultant. So everywhere in my dissertation that I talk about him, it's always like, this international format consultant that I spoke to. Another guy was an executive at a Russian TV production company. And he was like, how little can you say about me? And I was like, fairly little. He's like, just say a Russian producer. So that all he is a Russian producer with no information. And I had to be really careful about what I said because he's like, I really don't want this to be associated, say, with my company, because then they could easily figure out who I am. And I'm like, okay. So I had to be really careful about what I said because, he wanted an assurance of confidentiality. He was worried about political fallout. If he had known that only like maybe 15 people in the whole world were ever going to read my dissertation, he might have been less interested, but whatever, it's all good. People have their own things. But he had the choice, right? And I gave him the choice, and that was like our first question I asked him off the books, right? So like in terms of before I started recording our interview, I asked him that, and that's what he told me. So, okay, this one, how the data will be stored, or what I like to call the most commonly broken ethical thing that everyone is going to do. Because inevitably, what does it say it on here? So this is like the typical language that people use, and it's complete bullshit. Excuse my language. It's like your information will be stored on a secured and encrypted drive that will be separate from the internet and kept in a locked cabinet in our office. The truth is, I'm going to upload all of your data onto Google Drive and hope that Google has decent security is probably the more accurate. Like I literally, my one friend, Dorothy, was doing her ethics application for her project, and that she put it, it's like, I'm going to keep this in a locked filing cabinet, and I'm going to like have my dog swallow the key so that it can only be opened, every, I shouldn't actually say that, but, a locked filing cabinet on a separate hard drive. And the person that was looking, kind of reading over her ethics application was like, yeah, that's bull crap. You're 100% just storing this on your computer and probably uploading it to the cloud. And that's exactly true, right? But, we probably should disclose how we store data. It's probably one of the worst things. There's also sometimes things like, it used to be that you were only really allowed to store data for 5 years. The university's research ethics has changed that. You can now keep the data for as long as you want. By the way, I also violated that because I told my participants I would delete, the transcripts and the videos after 5 years. That was way more than 5 years ago. I still have them, and there's nothing anyone can really do about it. Because I too am a horribly unethical person when it comes to data storage. We BS a lot when it comes to that, and there's really, everybody knows it's BS, but you still have to say it like, this is how we're going to store your data, for the most part. Especially if it's more sensitive, that matters a lot more. Okay, and how the findings will be published, usually this is a pretty simple thing of just being like, I will use information from this, study in academic publications, like books and journal articles. And that's usually what most people say. Okay, so I'm sure that all makes sense, right? That's reasonably straightforward. Okay, I shouldn't tell people the truth about my terribly unethical behavior. Okay, yeah. Hey, this was my one research study. This was the actual consent letter I used, so you can kind of see it there. When I was the visiting researcher at St. Joseph's College, right? So you can see the kind of project that I did. We did a big survey. Okay, but yeah, respect for persons. Consent form is important. Why? Well, amongst other things, it tells people what they're going to do. It tells them, their ability to leave the study at any time. Sometimes, like when I did, right, what I have here is my information letter and consent form. So basically, I always put the two together. I've seen some people separate them so that you have an information letter and you have a consent form, but for my purposes, I just always put them together because it doesn't seem to make any sense to separate them. And yeah, so most typically, right, that's what you see. Yeah, so very important. Prospective participants must have the ability to understand. So, amongst other things, it has to be written in a very straightforward way so the average person will understand what you're talking about, right? No academic, high language, academic blah, blah, blah to hide the actual purpose of what you're doing. It has to be written in a very straightforward way. And you have to have a reasonable assurance that your participant is going to be able to understand what you're talking about, right? So, with people with, say, intellectual disabilities, there can be, or children, right, minors, there can be real boundaries in terms of if you think they might not be able to understand what they're consenting to, that's going to pose a problem. They have to have the actual ability to consent, right? So they have to be mentally competent. Generally, you have to be an adult to consent to things, or a guardian or parent has to consent for you, and all of these sorts of things, right? So you have to actually be able to consent. A person, say, with even like an elderly person for whom someone else has power of attorney, right? So most of their legal consents are handled through a third party. You would have to, theoretically, I don't know why you would be dealing with such a person in sociology, but if you were, right, you would have to get the person with power of attorney to sign off on it to be like strictly legal. Because obviously if someone has given power of attorney to someone else, they might not be fully mentally competent, right? So they have to have actual ability to consent. So again, children, people with certain disabilities, medical limitations, diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia, obviously, you're going to need someone else to sign off on the consent form. So that should be straightforward enough, I think. Okay. Yeah. Some in respect for persons, there are some challenges, right? It can be hard to give people absolutely all of the information to make a fully informed consent, especially, and here, it can be really impractical in some circumstances, like an ethnography, right, with participant observation, especially if, one of the things that you're worried about is that, there's a bunch of reasons that could be hard, but let's say that you're really worried about, your presence as a researcher and people knowing that you're there impacting the way they behave, or what's called reactivity, right? This can be a real challenge because in order to get informed consent, you're going to have to tell people what you're doing. and that may immediately change their behavior, right? So in ethnographies, it can be really hard to do informed consent. It is possible, but difficult, to convince a research ethics board that is a B. I just couldn't see what I was writing because my pen's laggy. To convince a research ethics board that you need to forego informed consent in your study. And they're going to ask you for very, very good reasons, right? So if you wanted to do our imagined study, where you go amongst the furries and live amongst the furries in their natural environment, it's not impossible to get, because there are, the research ethics board would probably understand that, you're trying to get as natural a look at this community as you can, but they will probably ask questions about whether there are alternate methods that would get you close to that without violating informed consent, right? So, informed consent, going without informed consent obviously prevents reactivity or contamination of subjects. Sometimes it can be impractical, with informed consent. Especially in qualitative work, where themes may be changing, and you might be sort of forced to react in real time to a chance to get research data. You could make a case why maybe I'm going to be in a very dynamic environment, and I'm just going to be reacting to things, and so I'm not going to seek informed consent because X, Y, Z. So there's that. Okay. Unknown people might enter the research setting in ethnographies, right? So you're in an environment that you don't fully control, right? I don't know. There's been a whole bunch of different kinds of research, but research on gangs, for example, where someone actually sort of started to not participate in a gang. That obviously is wrong. Don't commit crimes when you're doing your research. And apparently, this is the criminologists that have done a lot of work with people who have criminals. How shall we say that kindly? We can't. Or gang members. They will tell you that inevitably in researching with criminals, they will ask you at some point to do something that is illegal, which is something like, hey, could you hold on to this for me? Don't do that. Could you just keep this in the trunk of your car? Terrible idea. If you're going to the south side anyway, could you drop this off at this address? No, I cannot. And these are all things that at least one person in the department has actually been asked to do. Just like a brown paper package. Could you drop this off at this address for me? Terrible idea. Don't do it. You may be committing crimes. Don't commit crimes. Okay. Let's say you're researching, gangs, and you're sort of hanging out at a place that known gang members solicit, right? Oh, what's his name? Randall Contreras in LA has done this, right? Where he just hangs out at the locations where a lot of known Latino kind of gang members kind of come to play basketball and stuff. In that sort of situation, right, you could make the case, I'm not going to get informed consent because, there's people coming and going. I don't control the environment. And so it's impractical for me to stop, these people coming into the community center to play basketball and be like, in order to observe you, could I just get you to sign off on this paper, right? Obviously, in those kinds of cases, you can make a case that the ethics notwithstanding, it's going to be wildly impractical for you to do this. Okay. Experiments, and again, I've warned you about this, you're not going to do any experiments for this course, right? You're going to write something much more simple to conceptualize than an experiment. But experiments, right, sometimes you actually need to employ deception, and so you can't get informed consent. Because if you told people what you were looking for, they might try to give it to you, right? Like if you're like, I am looking for people's natural social reactions of using humor to diffuse tense situations, and then everybody's just going to start telling jokes, right? And so your experiment is going to be ruined. But you're actually just going to put people in a tense situation. You see how many of them, respond with jokes. You might actually tell them on the paper, I am, looking to have you interact with other participants in a natural environment, and leave out what you're actually looking for, right? So you want to avoid, in experimental designs, you want to avoid reactive effects as much as possible because it ruins the validity of your experiment, right? So the second people know they're being studied, they act differently, right? And we know this because we've seen this so many times. Even like if you try to take a picture of your friends, one of your friends is going to start goofing off and making bunny ears behind someone's head, right? That's a reactive effect. Anytime people are being observed and they know it, they do silly things, and you don't want silly things. Okay, so some deception can be allowed. It can be seen as problematic, and increasingly, research ethics boards are very reticent to allow any kind of deception, simply because in the past it's been used in unethical ways. So if there is deception, it has to be clearly justified, right? Like there's no other way. Okay, so two things. A, you have to have minimal risk. Can I write faster with my finger? No. Oh yeah, I'll just say it. You have to have minimal risk, right? So if you're going to deceive people, there has to be very little risk to their well-being in that deception. So you can't deceive them and then put them into harm's way, because obviously then, that's, I don't think I have to explain why that's not okay. Minimal risk, and the purpose, like you have to sort of make a case that there's no other way for you to get the data other than using that deception, that any kind of honesty is going to ultimately lead to reactivity. And then debriefing tends to be important, right? They'll tell you things like, come on, why are you doing that? I'm going to click my pen button and see if it changes. Okay, debriefing is really important, which is usually if you've used deception after the experiment, and this is most common in experiments, after the experiment is over, you then have to explain to the participant what you were actually doing, often with the caveat that they then get to decide whether to include their data or not, right? So if you told them a big fat lie about what they were doing, sometimes you'll hand them like a letter at the end. It's like, hey, by the way, we told you we were doing this. We're actually looking for this instead. If you have any concerns about what we did, contact this person. If you would like your data removed from the study, please inform this person and it will be done post haste, right? And again, if you meet all those things, you might be able to get away with tricking people. All making sense? All right. I know ethics is so thrilling. Okay, concern for welfare, right? So what you want, obviously, is the well-being of the person, group, or community affected by the research, and avoiding harm, embarrassment, inadvertent identification, is important. So I mean, there's actually a big ethical sort of quandary here, because so I'll tell you a little bit. Recently, the journal Criminology, right, which is the leading journal in the field of criminology, decided that in order to raise the standards of the publication, they were going to require everyone who publishes in criminology to submit their data into an open kind of basically a database, right? So that any data that you're using would have to be in this database for anyone to peruse, and so people could check your results, right? Which in some senses is really smart and makes a lot of sense. However, some people, including Sandra Bucerius in the department, who's director of the CCR and sort of my boss, she wrote an open letter to the journal saying, okay, this is inherently problematic for qualitative work, right? Because she had done these studies of police in, I can't remember which city in Germany, but basically police departments in Germany, right? And she said, if I put this in an open data bank, right, when I was publishing off of it, people could have figured out who individual officers were just by the context of what they were saying, right? Just by the comments they made, by their age, by some of the language they were using. It would have been really easy for people who knew them to figure out who these people were. And you would have been, transgressing this inadvertent identification. Same thing when I was talking to that Russian TV executive, right? I had to be really careful in the way I phrased things so that I didn't, because he didn't want to be identified, that I would actually be inadvertently telling people who this was. So inadvertent identification ends up being, a risk, right? And you don't want to do that. If people don't want to be identified, you shouldn't identify them, right? If people give you a pseudonym, you can't give details about that person that would expose who they actually are. Yeah, I mean, identity and privacy issues, right? You want to make sure that people have the right to their privacy and their data to be used in a way that they are okay with. And yeah, that confidentiality has to be maintained where there's contact between the researcher and the subject, even online, right? So you have to keep their confidentiality in a way that respects them. Okay. Yeah, okay. Again, sometimes I get ahead of my slides. In qualitative research, right, it can be really difficult, especially, right, so, we were talking about case studies and ideographic research. When you write up case studies that are these really, really detailed accounts, you can end up, exposing a lot of information. Sometimes pseudonyms work, right? Pseudonyms can be good, or job titles or whatever, right? Those may be enough in a lot of cases, but in some cases you might be giving so much detail about a person or about a circumstance that a pseudonym might not be enough, and you might actually have to take more steps than that to make sure a person's identity is protected, right? You might actually have to say, I did, instead of being like, I did this research in Edmonton, you might actually have to say, I did this research in Red Deer or Calgary, right? So that there's no way that people could put things together. Or I did this, probably more likely, I did this research in a large city in Western Canada, right? Just to kind of obscure the details as much as possible, right? You'd want to really make sure that you're kind of keeping data as generalized as possible, so that you wouldn't be able to put it together. It could be Edmonton, it could be Calgary, it could be Winnipeg, could be Vancouver, right? It could be any number of places. Yeah, in-depth research, analysis, and reporting could give enough detail that people or locations could be identified, right? There's a lot of worry, in the project that Sandra did before was called the University of Alberta Prison Project. And they did these in-depth interviews with people who were incarcerated in federal prisons on units, right? They actually went on the units and talked to people. But then there was real concerns about, okay, we have to be careful because, if they told us something and then we then publish it, and someone finds out, they could be flagged as essentially like a stool pigeon, someone who's giving out information about other prisoners that could be used in a way that corrections and law enforcement could use, and then their actual physical safety could be at risk. So you have to think about all these things and be worried about how you're going to talk about people to make sure that they can't always be identified, right? Or they can never be identified using your research, and certainly that it couldn't come back and harm them in some way, either physically, or it could cost them a job, or whatever it happens to be, right? You want to make sure that your participants' privacy is respected so that they don't feel adverse effects from the publication of your research. Being an obscure researcher that no one cares about is apparently not good enough, though that was always my strategy. Okay. Excuse me. All right, so covert research, right? So if you're doing research with privacy, obviously all of these things, right? If you're doing covert research, so people don't know you're there, right? So I went and I bought my furry suit, and I went off to the furry convention, and I observed, the mating habits of the local furry population, or whatever my study is. Obviously that could be very intrusive, right? And people might, could obviously take offense to that being made public when they didn't consent. With covert research, obviously you can't get consent. So again, you're going to have to make the case in ethics that the benefit has to outweigh any harm to participants. Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what I'm saying. It's Friday afternoon. Basically, you being there in a covert sense doesn't raise any concerns over reactivity, right? That it's important that you be covert so that you don't get any reactive effect, and that you're not going to create them by being there. You might have to seek, permission for participants after the fact to use data if they are available. This can also be problematic. And I mean, you would have to ensure the anonymity of non-consenting participants, right? So if you were, again, I'll use my ridiculous furry example. If I was over at the Atlanta Furry Con and I was talking to Tim and he was dressed as a, weasel, and he told me, yeah, in my day job, I'm Tim, I'm from Cincinnati, right? I'm I'm a lawyer at the firm, imagined, right? You would definitely not want to put like, yeah, I talked to Tim, the weasel, who's a lawyer at, why did I choose weasel for a lawyer? I did not think this example through well enough. You'd want to make sure to take all of those details out, right? So that people wouldn't be reading it years later and be like, wait, is that Tim? Right? He does work at Imagined. Oh God, is he a furry? Right, you wouldn't want any of that to happen. So always keep that in mind. Even with covert research, you would then, of your own accord, having not told him that you're a researcher, create your own pseudonyms and ways of not identifying people, right? Because you didn't get their consent. Okay. 3 minutes. All right, I'll try to do duty to report. This is sometimes a controversial one. So duty to report, like any other kind of, how to put this? So like teachers, like doctors, like social workers, like anyone who deals potentially with vulnerable populations, if for whatever reason you thought that there was a crime or there was potential to harm to a minor or a person in a vulnerable circumstance, a chance of, crime, you have a duty to report these things in a reasonable way, right? So like, I'm going to use a slightly absurd example. If you were interviewing gang members and they told you that they were going to hold up the Bank of Montreal on, downtown, that they were going to go in there with guns and they were going to rob that bank, right? You would have a duty to report that to law enforcement if they give you, specific, clear information of a crime that they are going to commit. Confident, we're not lawyers as researchers, so we don't have like attorney-client privilege or anything like that. So if you know that there's a crime going to be committed, if there's going to be harm to a child, or abuse of an elderly person, abuse of, a vulnerable person, you have the same duty to report as, anyone in a position like that, right? Psychologist, social worker, and all of those things. Often, privacy and confidentiality rules are used to set boundaries on what can be disclosed to a researcher and what will result in a report to an outside agency. So if you were doing a research project where you thought this was possible, right? You would put this in your information and consent letter, right? Like the same way, like if you've ever been to therapy, right? One of the first things the therapist will tell you is like, if you tell me you're going to harm someone else, right? Or there's imminent risk that you're going to do something, I have to report that. If you tell me you're abusing a child, right, I have to report that to the police, right? And you could put that in your consent letter. Hey, any criminal activity, that's specific, if you tell me those things, I have to report them to the police. If you tell me about the, abuse or harm to a child, blah, 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 blah. You can have that all in your consent letter. And when they're kind of looking it over and signing it, you're like, just so you know, right? So, because, you do have that duty. You can't hold back things. You don't have any kind of legal privilege in the way that a doctor, a lawyer, or any of those people do. So potentially, if you fail to report those things and someone finds out, you could be criminally or civilly liable for not having reported those things. And I'm sure you want to be sued or sent to prison as much as anyone else. So, always good. And again, for criminologists, this is probably more something you have to worry about. For your average sociologist, less so. Okay. Oh yeah. And anything like that that's in your, one of the things that I should tell you is when you put in your research ethics approval, you put your information and consent letter in there so they would see that you flagged that in there. Okay, that is all for today. I'm overtime. I'm sorry, I shouldn't go overtime. All right, we're done. We'll talk on Monday. Remember, Sunday at midnight, your mini lab is due. I don't know why I'm clapping.